an unusual event for us. We don't usually have political figures come and talk, and I thought I would explain to you why. You know, we get a lot of questions here at the center about, you know, how people can get involved in foreign policy and national security, and I either say what I'm paid to say, which is go to law school, or I say go to graduate school in foreign affairs or international relations. More and more, one of the things that I say is go into politics. If you want things to get better in your world, if you want things to change, one of the things you ought to consider is running for office. And usually when I say that to people, they say, I'm too young. So I thought that I would find somebody whose views were particularly creative, particularly interesting, and who's been in politics since, I guess, since you graduated law school. Is that correct?
Earlier than that.
Yeah. So Senator Chris Murphy is from my home state, Connecticut, which is, of course, the best state in the Union and has always had the best politicians. He thinks of himself as a progressive when it comes to foreign policy. BuzzFeed has referred to him as the Elizabeth Warren of foreign policy, which I think is an interesting, which we can discuss at a later date. He is somebody who both thinks the big thoughts and does the hard work. He's known for walking across the state of Connecticut so that he could find the people on his path and talk to them. He has been involved in foreign relations since he went to the Senate. He is on the Foreign Relations Committee, but he has worked hard on counterterrorism, on topics related to Europe, on topics related to South Asia and other areas of the world. He entered politics, he says, before he graduated law school. I will say I thought it was when he was 26, 24, 25, somewhere. But he has risen slowly but surely from the local level to the state level to the national level to the Senate. And so I am absolutely delighted to have him come and speak to us. I hope this is the first of many times. The senator will speak for as long as he wants. Then there will be a short Q&A between myself and the senator, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much, Karen, for having me and for the center for hosting me here. I'm going to stand over here so I'm not standing at the podium. I really appreciate the opportunity to come by. I always love when, you know, my age is part of my biography. I am the youngest Democrat, one of the youngest members of the Senate, but that's a very low bar. I always explain it by way of a quick story. So I take part in a charity baseball game every year that's played in Congress and trying to do. Spending time in Washington has been played for 100 years. Republicans against Democrats, and it's not softball, it's hardball, and raises hundreds of thousands of dollars for charity. And I've played all 10 years. I'm the catcher for the Democratic team, and I stopped playing baseball when I was probably 15, 16 years old. I'm not very good. I'm the catcher for the Democratic team because I'm the only member of the Senate or the House who can squat down and get back up. So age is all relative in the Senate. But I did enter politics at a young age, and I am part of a generation whose political coming of age happened during the period of time in which the United States was in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I ran for Congress in 2006 as an opponent of the war in Iraq and a critic of the way in which the war in Afghanistan had been conducted. And I was part of a wave of new members of Congress in 2006 that won office in part, or maybe primarily because of how upset the American public was with the mistakes that we had made with respect to military engagement overseas. And yet today, I stand here in front of you as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, as a committed internationalist, as someone who believes that the United States can be a force for good in the world, believes in an America that is forward deployed. And so I guess I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about how you remain an internationalist today. How do you believe in a forward deployed America? While also being true to your roots when it comes to the misadventures that we have had around the world. And I maybe wanted to sort of frame the discussion today through, three hazards that I've learned in my short time working in foreign policy. I'm a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. So I think that I'm spending more time than most trying to understand America's place in the world, and I have tried to be a leader in what I would call, the school of progressive foreign policy. So, here's my attempt to lay out what I think some of the hazards are for the United States as we try to figure out our place in the world. The first is this. The first is to understand the danger of a world that has shifted very quickly. A world that has changed in terms of power centers, methods of exerting power. The danger of that changing world and a set of tools that the Congress hands to the president to interact with the world that is largely unchanged over the course of the last 50 years. So I'm a big believer in the United States having the biggest, baddest, best funded, most capable military in the world. I do believe in peace through strength. I think that if you have a strong military, you're likely going to scare off people from coming after you or coming after your friends and allies. But in a world of asymmetric warfare, where those big conventional armies and pieces of equipment that we buy don't match up really well against the tactics that a non-state actor like ISIL uses, or even a state actor like Russia uses, maybe it doesn't make sense today to have more members of military bands than diplomats at the State Department. Think about that. We spend 20 times as much money in the military as we do on non-military international support. The result of that is that you have more lawyers at the Department of Defense than you have diplomats at the Department of State, more members of military bands than you have diplomats. Russia's a great example, right? Russia has a conventional military strength to it. But the way in which it's really exerting its sort of newfound aggression in and around the region is in ways that are very different than an exertion of military strength. So it uses its energy resources to essentially try to buy off the countries around it. And we have no comparable ability to, in a really meaningful way, try to help make countries energy independent. We have a little office at the Department of State that works on energy independence, but we don't have actually any money to help countries try to find a way to power their country other than Russian oil or gas. Russia's buying off people left and right. They're just handing out checks. They're playing upon corrupt governments. And yeah, we spend a little bit of money on democracy building, and we try to help countries who want to root out corruption and stand up new prosecutorial offices, but it's pittance compared to what we used to spend back in the 1950s or 60s on those projects. We just really don't have the capacity to try to help fight corruption so that there are less supplicants for the kind of offers that the Russians are making. The Russians spend a lot of time spreading misinformation and propaganda out across the regions that they're trying to find influence in. And we're stuck with Radio Free Europe and Voice of America. We don't have any modern capability to try to fight the Russian soap operas, which are in sort of meaningful but quieter ways spreading a narrative that's friendly to their vision of the world. So we just haven't given the president the resources that he needs to meet these new challenges. And one of the risks, the hazards of modern American foreign policy is that we sort of expect the president to be able to solve all these new challenges while giving him none of the tools that he actually needs to meet those new challenges. We make a lot of military hardware in Connecticut. It keeps this country safe, but much of it is not terribly effective when it comes to some of these nuanced challenges against terrorism or against new aggressive actors like the Russians. Here's the second hazard. The second hazard is to not understand that the things we do here, the way in which we conduct our affairs in the United States matters when it comes to our ability to lead the world. And I know that Karen has done a lot of work talking about our system of justice here, our very quiet and unauthorized drone war that has killed thousands of civilians, as well as intended targets overseas. And so the way in which we conduct our business these days matters more than ever for two reasons. One, this isn't a bipolar world anymore. It's not just are you with the United States or are you with the Soviet Union. Today, if you're a free agent, you have a lot of suitors. You have a lot of potential partners. You can be with the Russians, you can be with the Chinese, you can be with the Brazilians, you can be with us. And so the model that we create, right, and how attractive it is, matters more than ever in a world of, in a multipolar world. That plays out interestingly when it comes to another issue that I care deeply about, guns. How does guns factor in foreign policy? Well, Matthew Barzon is our ambassador to Great Britain. He does this interesting exercise where he goes to middle schools and high schools and he gives every kid 2 index cards. And he asks them to write on one index card something they really like about the United States, and on the other index card something that they don't like about the United States, or they don't understand, they find frustrating. He called me a couple months into doing this exercise and he says, would you believe that there's one word that shows up on 80% of the cards where you're supposed to say something that frustrates you about the United States? I sort of thought about it and I said, that's surprising, but I can kind of imagine what it is. It's like a rat, or it's NSA, or it's spying. He said, no. It's guns. It's guns. People in England fundamentally don't understand this culture of gun violence that we have here. And to them, it makes the United States just a much less attractive place. And so the things that we do here, the growing economic disparity, the violence on our streets, the mass shootings, all of that stuff is not a great advertisement for countries who have a lot of suitors today to sign up with us. But of course, it also matters because on this fight against extremism, we're battling an enemy that is trying to perpetuate this mythology that the East is at war with the West. And so every time that state legislature passes a bill to ban Sharia law, or a municipality rejects the zoning application of a mosque, or a presidential candidate blames all of the country's security problems on the Muslim faith, that's obviously terrible for the United States, in that it is bulletin board material, all of it, from the little stuff to the big stuff, for terrorist recruiters. What we do here now matters more than ever in terms of our ability to fight enemies and win friends abroad. And then the third hazard is, is one that's been around for a long time, but is pesky and just won't go away. And that's good old-fashioned hubris. The belief that we are this exceptionally powerful, indispensable nation who must be able to solve every problem in the world. If you start with that assumption, my contention is you are going to get into a lot of trouble that you could otherwise avoid. And I would argue that Syria is a perfect example of this. I don't believe there is an American solution to what is happening, to the tragedy, to the horror that's going on in Syria today. I think we can be a participant in the solution, but I don't think there is an American-branded, an American-led solution. Now, we know that we could temporarily fix it. We could put in 200, 300,000 American troops, and we could, for as long as those 200, 300,000 troops were there, settle it down. But we are in Syria in part because of that mistake that we made in Iraq. That temporarily solves the problem, but creates more problems down the road. What we're doing today is just prolonging the conflict. What we're doing today, by sort of bleeding support to the opposition, bit by bit by bit, engaging in half measure after half measure, is just making the conflict go on even longer than it would have if the United States hadn't been involved in the first place. We can go back and argue whether we should have said Bashar al-Assad should have gone, whether that was a smart policy. But if you start from the assumption in every part of the world that the United States can fix it, I think you've gone wrong right from the start. And you often will end up making things worse, not better. Some catastrophes in this world, some conflicts, have to have local organic solutions. Sometimes American intervention, in particular American military intervention, doesn't make things better, it can make things worse. And that's a hard thing to swallow if you are a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. If you were an American president, the belief that there are some things out there that the United States can't fix. But as we watch this ongoing tragedy in Syria play out, it's increasingly hard to understand how anything the United States has done there, at least in a military sense, has made things better, not worse. So I wrote an article with two of my colleagues about 2 years ago outlining the foundations of what we believe is a progressive foreign policy, and you can read that to sort of understand some of the more proactive things that we think are necessary. I'm giving you, kind of the bad news, the hazards. But from the hazards flow all sorts of policy prescriptions, right? Being, handling drone strikes much differently than you do today. Really resourcing up all of those tools that right now are dramatically under-resourced. Thinking about that balance between non-military foreign budgeting and military foreign budgeting, and continuing a policy that has largely been the hallmark of Obama's foreign policy, one of restraint. Understanding that that's a smart play, often not a weak play. So I certainly point you to that to sort of see some more proactive recommendations, but I thought to set the stage, I'd just sort of share with you some of the lessons that I've learned. Listen, we lost an enormous amount of talent when it came to Congress's ability to weigh in on foreign policy questions in a very short period of time. Think about all the giants that left. The Foreign Relations Committee, Dick Lugar, and Joe Biden, and John Kerry, and Chris Dodd, and Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, right, all gone. And so to the extent that I'm able to be a leader on foreign policy, it's in part because there's a vacuum that exists. But the vacuum is much larger than just individuals who left the United States Senate. There's a bigger vacuum when it comes to just the general input that Congress has traditionally had when it comes to the foreign policy direction of this country. It's harder today than ever before for Congress to weigh in, because it's not as simple as declaring war against a defined enemy. Right? The enemy is much more diffuse. It's much more shadowy. The parameters of war are a little bit harder to figure out if you're the war-declaring agency. And it's a lot easier to do things outside of the public eye. It's a lot easier just to staff up the covert agencies and let them run wild so that nobody really has to deal with those consequences. Nobody really has to be held accountable. But Congress has to get back in the game as well, which is one of the reasons why I've tried to step up and even in my first term in the United States Senate, try to provide some direction for progressives in the Senate who want to be both critics of the way that we've engaged in the world in the past, but internationalists, try to find some place for them to land. So again, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to be here. Really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, everybody.
So I'm not sure if that was optimistic or pessimistic. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of this. So basically what you're saying is that we're living in new times, and that we need a new generation, and have a new generation of potential leaders to take us to those new times in the foreign policy arena. And I guess one of the questions is, I sort of hear in the back of my mind the sort of lefty critic saying, yeah, but there's a military-industrial complex, and they sort of push the policy in ways that make it very difficult for there to be any kind of change. You live in Connecticut, where the military-industrial industry is central to the economy of the state. How should we respond to that pushback?
Well, I tried to lay that out at the beginning, which is that I don't necessarily think this is an either-or proposition, right? I don't think that this is a zero-sum game in which you decide to downsize the military by the corresponding number that you increase your non-military funding. The reality is that during the 1950s, we were spending a big percentage of our GDP on the military, but we were also spending 3% of our GDP on foreign aid. Today we are spending 0.1% of our GDP on foreign aid. We have had just a remarkable downsizing of the non-military funding component to our federal budget when it concerns the international affairs budget. So I frankly would argue that that given the threats that we face, and given the fact that there are conventional militaries out there that are stronger than ever before, Russia and China as the primary examples, this is not the moment to roll back our commitment to build the F-35s or to replace the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines. We need to continue those commitments. But moving from spending 0.1% of your GDP on non-military foreign investment to 0.3% is not a ridiculous conversation to have.
Okay, so in that move to a larger percentage, that would include beefing up perhaps the State Department, beefing up the diplomatic corps. Are you talking about reviving some of the programs or rethinking and then reviving some budgetary issues at USAID? I mean, when you say that development, like what's in that basket?
So, I mean, I think you have to step back and we have to make a permanent decision as to who's going to do what in our foreign policy infrastructure. And what has happened over time is that everything has shifted right? So diplomacy has shifted away from the State Department to the Department of Defense, and military activity has shifted away from the Department of Defense over to the CIA and to the NSA, right? So I would argue to sort of shift everything back, right? So I would argue that much of the military program that the CIA is doing, including the drone program, should move back over to the Department of Defense so that we can have real oversight over it. Then I would also argue that the stuff that the Department of Defense today is doing, like rebuilding Afghanistan's agriculture, should move back over to the Department of State or to civilian agencies. Now there's a great book, that just came out by Rosa Brooks, who makes this case that sort of everything has become the military. And she sort of is a little bit more fatalistic about it and says the military is going to do it, so just make the military better at it. I think that's a pretty bad long-term prophecy. So I would just make the Department of State better at it. But that would mean probably moving some money from state over to from the DoD over to the Department of State, and then making the Department of State much more nimble at those kind of activities.
Right. So part of that is that the military is uncertain about its future. In a future where there's cyber war, where cyber is so much of what people are talking about, the military wants to capture that. Part of this is rethinking the role of the military, which is why they made such a push to be in the development sphere. Do you think maybe giving them more of the cyber portfolio will make them able to relinquish some of this? It doesn't have to be just drone warfare.
Yeah, I think that certainly is that likely stays in and around the Department of Defense, and I understand the arguments for why there's some good reason to house all of that in the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense, again, this is back to Brooks's theory here, but that the Department of Defense is kind of selling itself as a Walmart, right? Where anything you need in order to try to make a place better, you can get from the Department of Defense. And they're able to do that well, in part because they can protect whatever they do, and the State Department has a hard time protecting what they do because they need the military to do that. But ultimately, the Department of Defense is never going to be an agriculture agency. And so if they are in charge of fixing every problem, then everything's going to look like a nail, right? I mean, everything's going to look like a military problem, and that sort of gets you into problems from the outset. They won't start by fixing the agriculture problem. They'll start by trying to address the military problem.
So let's move on. What are the things that you've made a name for yourself with Saudi Arabia? Because your stance on Saudi Arabia, and given both JASTA and the bill, the civilian suits bill, there's a 9/11 civilian suits bill. There's a real sense that the United States is rethinking, at least in some parts of the United States, is rethinking this very long-standing, very entrenched relationship with the Saudis. Do you want to explain a little bit about how you come at this as what seems to be, you think, a central piece of the foreign policy structure that needs to be at least rethought?
So I think you're right that we are rethinking this relationship with the Saudis, and you gave a couple good examples. I forced a vote 2 weeks ago on a provision to stop a arms sale to Saudi Arabia that we knew was going to fail, but it did get between a quarter and a third of the Senate objecting to arms sales, continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which is a pretty big thing. So here's why I think we need to rethink it. I think we are all coming to grips with the fact that the sort of blunt force of military power is not a terribly effective tool to fight terrorism. That even as we push ISIS into a more contracted area, that just seems to push them out and make them more interested in attacking us here at home or our European friends there. And we obviously are living with the result of a very poorly planned and thought out military engagement in Iraq. So everybody's sort of saying, okay, the military isn't the best way to stamp out ISIS, to stamp out extremism, then shouldn't we start sort of going backwards in time and figuring out sort of why they get to the position of strength in the first place? And if you try to trace back the roots of extremism, I would argue, and a lot of other people would argue, that those roots move in some way, shape, or form through the growing conservative version of Islam that is taking root in places as diverse as Egypt and Pristina. And it is all funded by clerics and nonprofit organizations and imams associated with the Saudi government or associated with other Gulf state actors. And so I think we've got to sort of understand that if we don't do something about the spread of Wahhabism across the globe, we're going to have a hard time trying to fight back against extremism, because one is the building block of the other. Second, when you have an ally, that generally means that they listen to you when you raise concerns with them. And in Yemen, the Saudis are fighting a civil war that is going disastrously for two primary reasons. One, they are killing civilians left and right and ignoring U.S. direction on targeting, ignoring it. Second, they are refusing to fight Al-Qaeda, who has grown exponentially in the eastern parts of Yemen, despite our pleas to use our bombs and our refueling planes to go after Al-Qaeda, but they won't do it. And so, I think the conversation about extremism has to involve a conversation about Wahhabism. And this war in Yemen, which is going really bad for a lot of reasons, is proof that maybe this alliance isn't as strong as we thought.
There's been a lot of talk around the world, as you say, in Bosnia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and in many other countries about Wahhabism, and sort of trying to separate out Wahhabi from Saudi, sort of as if there's a way to carve that space. So what's happening is actually a coalition of voices from around the world, not just yours. Do you think that there will be some kind, or there's a possibility for some kind of general feeling, and I don't know where the Europeans are weighing in on this outside of Eastern Europe, that this could be something, as you say, the world can't fix all problems, that this could be a general pressure that can be brought to bear upon the Saudis, or do you really think this is one that has been deposited in our laps, or that we've taken on to fix?
Well, we're having this conversation today, but of course this is a problem that dates back to 1979, right? This is a problem that dates back to the Iranian Revolution, and the founding of the Islamic State in Iran prompted the Saudis to sort of wake up to the notion that they were in a contest for essentially who controls the brand and the type of Islam that's practiced throughout the region. And so we're playing a crazy game of catch up here that's hard to do. But the Saudis do rely on us as their primary security partner. And by the way, there aren't a lot of other options for the Saudis right now. I mean, some people have always said, well, the Russians are there. Well, the Russians are sort of getting in bed with the Iranians in a way that doesn't make them real attractive to the Saudis. Europeans aren't really interested in stepping into our place. So we have levers with the Saudis that we can play that we are not today. We have sold more arms to the Saudis in the Obama administration than every other administration combined. So we aren't sending messages of sort of chilled enthusiasm for the alliance today. We are doubling down on the military relationship. So we're just not playing some cards that we should.
So that brings us to the Iran case, because in a way, the Iran-U.S. nuclear negotiated deal, and the Saudi arms munitions gift are somehow balanced, I think, in the mind of the administration. So do you think that the Iran nuclear deal would have been possible without some kind of sign to the Saudis that we had something to give them, or are these just completely?
I think I think it's a fascinating question, right? Because that's the popular impression here,
Yeah.
and I don't have this from no one in the administration has ever represented that there was a sort of back of the agreement invisible ink deal, right? So, but the assumption is that as part of as part of the Iran deal, that the Saudis, well, at least are cozying up to them when it comes to these military sales, is in an effort to try to get right with them after the Iran deal. So your question is, what would have happened if the Saudis had opposed the Iran deal? But so the Israelis opposed the Iran deal with every ounce of their being, right? An exceptional speech before Congress by the Israeli Prime Minister. Let me tell you, Israel has 20 times the persuasive strength in Congress than Saudi Arabia does. And even with Benjamin Netanyahu playing every conceivable card that he couldn't stop that deal from going into effect. So I'm not sure that had the Saudis been upset about it in a more public way that they could have stopped it either. But listen, I signed on to that deal, I voted for it, but I didn't vote for any side agreement to arm the Saudis in their growing proxy war with Iran, and my colleagues didn't either.
One more question, and then I'm going to open up to you guys, and that has to do with terrorism. I'm sure when we came here, you had a question about terrorism. Some of the things I've read or watched you say have to do with sort of tamping down fear about terrorism. And I'm assuming you meant here as well as particularly here, but I'm curious to know, how do you see the threat of ISIS to the United States? And just your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's serious. But I also know what the goal of terrorism is, right? The concept of terrorism is simple. It's to enact a fear of the enemy that is greatly outsized compared to the actual threat, right? That's the goal of terrorism, is to do something that is so exceptionally violent or so exceptionally noteworthy that you fear the organization more than you really should if you knew their capabilities. And so I just think you have to go into that conversation with that as your underlying assumption. There is no existential threat to the United States today, right? ISIS can hurt a lot of people, but they cannot invade this country. And so I do think we have to right-size the threat and understand, as somebody who cares about gun violence, that there are, I don't know what the latest number is, but somewhere in the order of 100 times the number of people dying from gun violence in the streets of America than there are from acts of terrorism. So I just think you want to right-size the threat and probably right-size the conversation. That being said, there are just some easy things that we could do that would make us legitimately safer and feel safer. It just makes no sense that if you are on one of these terrorist watch lists, you can't get on a plane, but you can walk into a gun store and buy an assault weapon and walk out the next day and start firing. I mean, that's an easy thing to do. So I want to right-size the threat, but I want to acknowledge that there are steps that we could take. Like not threatening to shut down the Department of Homeland Security. Like that would probably be a good thing to do to make the country feel better about the threat and to actually confront the threat, not threatening the shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security as almost happened a year and a half ago. So there's some easy things that we can't do.
Well, more of that later. So it's time for your questions. So over here on the edge here. Wait for the microphone just so everybody can hear you.
Thank you. So, Senator, you recently stated that, quote, the U.S. owns in some way every civilian death in Yemen. And I really appreciate hearing you say that in such strong terms. I wanted to ask you today if you would go as far as to say the U.S. is actually guilty of aiding and abetting Saudi war crimes there, and if not, why not?
Well, I'm not an international, I'm not an expert in international law, so I don't know what technicalities are around being guilty or not guilty. So, what I said is what I hold to, which is that there's a United States imprint, a signature, a connection to every death that happens there. For those of you that don't know, the Saudis, have for the course of the last year and a half been bombing the Houthis. They're new to this. The Saudis are new to Connecticut warfare, and so they're pretty bad at it. And we help them with targeting, but we don't pick the targets. And they've ended up just misfiring an awful lot. And then they've ended up targeting some places that we begged them not to target. We've told them, for instance, not to hit bridges that are used for humanitarian relief. They don't listen to us. They still hit the bridges. But the bombing campaign could not happen without the United States. That's the reason why I say that there's a U.S. imprint on every civilian death. We refuel the planes. We have sold them the bombs. We replenish them with a secondary sale. We give them the intelligence and the targeting. Yes, it's their planes and their pilots that drop them, but without us, they couldn't do it. And so I would argue the United States should stop participating in this war, at the very least until the Saudis make some clear changes to do better targeting and to start fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But if they don't make those commitments, I don't see how this war right now is accruing to our benefit. If you talk to Yemenis, and I've spent time talking to Yemeni Americans who have contacts back there, this is not, their family members there, this is not received in Yemen as a Saudi bombing campaign. This is an American bombing campaign, or a American-Saudi bombing campaign. So you are breeding future recruits for the groups that we pledge to be fighting in the region every day that we continue this.
So part of your counterterrorism, you always say the limits of our counterterrorism strategy would be to stop doing that.
Like stop doing yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think in that case, it's a really interesting case, right? Because why are we supporting the Saudis? Well, because in this case, the Saudis are in Yemen because they perceive this to be the latest front in the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We are allies with Saudi Arabia. We are not strategic allies with Iran. And so at some level, it makes sense for us to back our allies' play when they are in a fight against a country that is not our ally. But here we have a pretty clear decision to make. What is your priority? Is your priority weighing in on the proxy war, or is your priority fighting terrorism? In this case, the two are mutually exclusive. If you are weighing in with the Saudis, you are leading to the growth of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But if you back out and say we're not going to participate, then you are potentially at least giving a symbolic victory to the people that the Saudis are fighting.
Senator,
Wait for the microphone.
wait for the mic. Yes. Senator, I'm sometimes outraged by the news, and more recently as a lawyer, I was upset by the overwhelming vote to rescind the sovereign immunity that's recognized for lawsuits against Saudi Arabia regarding 9/11. And it's not that I'm unsympathetic, I was downtown on 9/11 myself, but I'm more concerned about what the world will do if it's okay to rescind sovereign immunity of other nations. What would you think would happen with regard to any possible reconsideration of this act in Congress, which I understand some people advocate?
Well, I reject the idea that may or may not be the premise of your question, that we have set a brand new precedent when it comes to the question of sovereign immunity for foreign nations. Because let's talk about what that bill actually did and what the prior law was. So the prior law was that you as a foreign government can be sued for acts of terrorism on U.S. soil if your conduct occurred on U.S. soil, or if you are a country that is on our list of state sponsors of terror. So if you are on our list of state sponsors of terror, then you are liable for the actions that you take on U.S. soil or not on U.S. soil. So we already have a pretty big glaring hole in foreign governments protection under sovereign immunity. Anything you do here, not covered. If you're on this list, no matter where you do it, not covered. So what we did here was we said, for the countries that aren't on that specific list, if you engage in an act of terrorism against the United States, then you are civilly liable whether it happens here or whether it happens there. So that is not a new precedent. That is an extension of exceptions to sovereign immunity that already existed, which is why I don't buy that there is a credible argument that ultimately that provides justification for whole new causes of action against U.S. citizens, because we already had lots of exceptions to sovereign immunity. We just extended them a little bit more under this act. What would happen if it came back? You know, if there's talk of a more narrowed compromise, I don't know. I mean, I think it'd be pretty silly, to be honest, to come back and amend a piece of legislation that you just had before you. I'd certainly take a look at what people were proposing, but I don't think it's a great way to go about doing our business.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks particularly for your remarks on the three hazards and connecting your coming of political age formed by the U.S. experience with large-scale interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Connecting your coming of age then with President Obama's foreign policy principle of restraint. But restraint sometimes seems like an embattled principle of foreign policy, sometimes in parts of both parties. My question is how you assess the prospects for foreign policy combining restraint and continued active engagement in international affairs. And if it is embattled now, 2016, how would you explain it, and what would you recommend going forward?
Well, this idea that the United States can solve every problem in the world is one that many leaders in Washington hold, but it's also, it's also part of American DNA, right? I mean, we believe in this concept of American exceptionalism. We have been taught through history books that, without the United States, the Holocaust would have continued, the Japanese would have continued to march through Asia. There were these moments where, whether it was World War I or World War II, where the U.S. was in a position of coming to the rescue. So we still view the world through that prism, even though the world has changed. Okay, that's true. It's also true that people know we've really screwed up lately. And so people are less enthusiastic for military engagement, especially in the Middle East, because of how poorly both Iraq and Afghanistan went. So, I think it's an interesting moment. I think people sort of take each proposed intervention on a case-by-case basis. I think they have there's still reasons that the American public would support intervention, because that's sort of the anchor of our history. But then there are more recent examples that have chilled folks' enthusiasm. So, if you remember, when the president came to Congress and asked for authorization to bomb Syria in the wake of the chemical weapons attacks, it was pretty clear that he was going to get rejected by the United States Congress. The Congress was going to vote against him because the American public rejected that plan. I've had two supermarket moments in my life, I call them, where I'm at the supermarket and an issue is so hot, so intense that somebody can't wait to get from one side of the supermarket to the other to tell me about it. They yell at me from the other side of the supermarket. First one's healthcare reform. So that summer of healthcare reform, people were just crazed about that. The second is the weekend between President Onassis' coming to Congress for authorization to bomb Syria and when the deal with Russia is cut. People were furious about that, and they were not going to stand for it. So I think the American public is on both sides of that.
Thank you very much, Senator. My question is on Syria. One, it concerns me, and I want to hear your opinion first. No matter who's president in Syria, there might be a reset button. Two, I am like you against truth because I feel that it will feel it's only a short-term resolution. And three, what about dividing Syria up? One nation, it will not work. I'm not saying immediately, but sometime down the road, perhaps Syria should be broken down? Is it three instead of three nations, not one? How do you feel about that?
Well, let me be clear. I mean, my prescription when it comes to Syria, and I don't claim to have the answer here. I don't think anybody should claim to have the answer here. It is not one of total disengagement. I think to the extent that there is a political solution, the United States will be a player. And again, I come back to the Saudis. I think that the only solution today is, and increasingly so, as Aleppo, as the conditions on Aleppo change by the hour, is a transition government that has Bashar al-Assad stay in power for a period of time. Now, who are the primary obstacles to getting that done? It's our friends in the Gulf states. And so again, when I talk about the messages that we're not sending to the Gulf states, it's about what they're doing in Yemen, but it's also about the fact that we're going to need them to come to the table in a way that makes them very uncomfortable when it comes to a transition government. I also think the United States has been largely out to lunch when it comes to the humanitarian response here. So the most important thing you can do in a country that has an intractable civil war is let anybody who wants to leave get out and put them somewhere safe. And we did that. We took hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees, hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Bosnian war. It's abysmal. It's unconscionable that we refuse to take more than 10,000 Syrian refugees. It's abysmal and unconscionable that we let the World Food Program shut down every so often because it doesn't have enough funding to feed the refugees who are in Lebanon and Jordan. So I do think there's components that we can that we can be engaged in. As to dividing Syria up, I mean, theoretically, that certainly sounds like an attractive idea. Practically, I'm not sure how you do it. The Kurdish section would be the most problematic. We have a pretty important ally, put at least light practices around it, that would object and would go down fighting to stop a Kurdish autonomous state or region within Syria. That would be one of the problems to that plan.
I want to follow up on the refugee comment. Is there a hope that the United States will ever take any more of these refugees, or do you think that conversation was concluded?
Well, this is a partisan issue. So, not all this stuff is partisan, but this one is. So, as long as the Republicans control the House of Representatives, we are not likely going to be able to take more than, about the 10,000, 15,000 range, because Congress sets the overall cap. When it comes to refugees, we have commitments that we really can't withdraw from for refugee programs that aren't in Syria. And so I am for dramatically lifting that cap. I would argue get as quickly as you can up to 60,000 or so Syrian refugees. But the Republicans in the House will not take that up. I mean, I would be, put it this way, I'd be very surprised if they took that up.
Senator Murphy, you described yourself as a progressive on foreign policy. Yet in 2014, you voted to approve appeals court Judge David Barron, the author of the illegal memos that justified the extrajudicial killing of U.S. citizens Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son Abdurrahman. Can you explain that vote?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't hold any judge to one decision. And listen, I also will probably have an unsatisfactory position to you and to some others when it comes to some of the new tools at the president's disposal to keep this country safe. I would argue that we should put in place a much more comprehensive and meaningful review process when it comes to our drone strikes. I think Congress has to get in the game here. Either Congress has to be involved in that oversight process, or we could consider setting up some judicial oversight process to authorize drone strikes. But what we're doing now is unsatisfactory. But I also am somebody who ultimately did vote for the renewed version of the Patriot Act. I think that there are ways that we've made it exponentially better, but I don't deny that it is important to give the administration some new tools with which to try to track terrorists down. I think they made it much better in the new engagement. But no, that's a judge that had a long history of other decisions that were pretty good advertisement for.
In terms of those tools, and I'm going to take a final question too, In terms of those tools going forward, because, you know, the Patriot Act sunset, as you said, there's this new act, it doesn't have the same surveillance authorities. There's been a lot of talk about renewing the surveillance authorities that are proximate to what they had in the past. Do you think it's possible that the surveillance authorities are going to get broader? Or do you think that conversation is going to just be left to other authorities that are already in place?
I mean, that's hard to know. I mean, it'll be dictated by events. I mean, I think that.
Meaning if there's a terrorist event, I know.
Yeah, and if we sort of see a clear hole in our, you know, in our surveillance, infrastructure that we need to fill. But no, I think, you know, listen, we worked really hard to get the USA Freedom Act, right? I mean, it took a long time to get to a point where the majority of the House and the Senate could support some scaled down reauthorization of the Patriot Act. And so I don't see there being a lot of enthusiasm to revisit that debate.
That way.
Thank you, Sam. I know this hasn't come up during your discussion regarding foreign policy, but what's your viewpoint regarding North Korea being the possibly the most dangerous region in terms of potential warfare? And what would be your recommendation regarding feasible solution for U.S. government to take action over there, especially in light of recent South Korean government's presumed failed policy of sunshine policy, where it's like a small version of Marshall Plan, where they provide some kind of aid and opening up.
Listen, I was just in the region earlier this summer. I was in Seoul and went up to the demilitarized zone along the border. Listen, we're stuck. We're stuck with not a lot of good cards to play, and so we're going to stick around in South Korea longer than we had planned. That's one thing we're going to do. We had a planned withdrawal, or we were going to essentially transfer over conflict authority to the South Koreans in 2018. I think that we are now going to have a footprint there, a command and control footprint for a longer period of time than initially planned. That sends a very strong message to the North Koreans. Our relationship with China, which we can go into, is as complicated as it gets, but one of the reasons that I worry about some of the language that's thrown around suggesting we should just treat China as an adversary is because ultimately any path towards a changed disposition in Pyongyang is through the Chinese government. And so we have to have a relationship with China diplomatically and strategically so that if there is an opening ultimately to send a message to the North Koreans, that we can do it through the Chinese. So we passed a new sanctions law about 6 months ago, so we do have a new set of U.S. sanctions that are going into place. Don't discount the impact of sanctions. We saw them work in Iran, different game in North Korea, but we are doubling down on sanctions policy as well. That's an unsatisfactory answer.
And then we'll take these in a row, and then.
At Northwestern University, at Northwestern University about a year and a half ago, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, gave a novel interpretation of the Fifth Amendment and justifying the killing of U.S. citizens without due process. He said, oh, the language of the Fifth Amendment doesn't say judicial process, it just says due process. And all those Northwestern University law students took notes and said, wow, this will probably be on the exam. New interpretation of the Constitution. Well, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about Obama arrogating to himself the right to kill American citizens without any process?
You want to take it in a row, or?
Yeah, no, let's get Ed.
Right,
We'll wait for the microphone.
yes, thank you, Senator. The question I had, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that we could do as a country to project American power and influence and possibly fight terrorism was to build up the State Department and maybe maybe decrease military intervention. And I was wondering if you had any ideas on what sort of activities we might be able to do to make that happen.
Okay, so on those two, so yes, of course that makes me uncomfortable, right? And of course it makes me, just squeamish to think that a United States president has the ability to make the decision on his own to carry out a strike against a U.S. civilian. Of course, we're not having that discussion in the way that we should, because everybody's pretty sure that this guy probably was an appropriate target, but you're identifying the problem, which is that oftentimes we won't even know. So that's why I would argue for setting up a new process that the administration has to go through in order to approve these strikes, to have a body of experts or a body of judges that is overseeing the legality of these strikes and the appropriateness of them. There's a pretty amazing piece of literature out there that's done by the Trace, I think, that got as much as they could on all of the drone strikes that we had done, came to the conclusion that in about 90% of the cases, we hit the wrong person. So separate and aside from this complicated legal question of targeting Americans with drones, we also are killing a lot of the wrong people, which speaks to the need for some additional oversight. On this question of what the State Department can be doing better, well, again, I would argue that a lot of the programming the Department of Defense is doing, the State Department should be doing. But we also need the State Department to be much more nimble. One of the reasons that the Department of Defense does everything is that they're really good at doing stuff really fast and really quick. The Department of State is not good at doing stuff really fast and really quick, in part because we've severely compartmentalized them. We give them money for this country and for this function. And so, take a problem like Al-Shabaab, right? I mean, everybody that followed Al-Shabaab could have told you that they were moving into northern Kenya, that that's where they were heading. And anybody that had the ability to move money around would have decided about a year earlier to really put a bunch of money into Kenya, to stand up local law enforcement, to put money into governance, to make sure that as many people as possible had had access to safe drinking water, so that they didn't say yes when a terrorist organization came in and said, we'll do it for you. But the State Department didn't have that ability, because all their money, they couldn't take money from Malawi and move it into Kenya. They couldn't take money from a democracy account and move it into, so when I talk about this, I think it's about more resources at state, but it's also about more nimble and more fungible resources, less compartmentalized resources, because as the threat shifts, then state has to be able to shift. And right now, because DOD has big fungible pots of money, right? We give them $10 billion every year just to do whatever arms sales they want to do, separate and aside from the arms sales that we approve. DOD is a lot better at doing stuff really quickly.
I can't let you go and feel like I did a good job with foreign policy without bringing up Russia.
I thought you were going to say I think you said the presidential campaign. Like, we haven't talked about the fact that the presidential campaign.
No, I'm not brave. But even though I'm not brave, I do want to talk about Russia just for a couple of minutes, which is that the relationship between Russia and the United States has deteriorated very quickly over the past few weeks. I mean, it's been coming, but it's getting worse and worse. How should we view this? Do you believe that do you have a sense that this is not fixable? Were to come back to it, should we be concerned? How do you think about this?
Well, let's start from the premise that Russia is panicking, and let's start from a position of understanding the fundamental weakness of the Russian economy and the Russian state today. We are not going to be in a long-term contest with Russia as we know it for hegemony in the region or the Middle East. That economy is sinking by the day, and our policy with Russia should be a long-term policy of essentially waiting out a country whose economy, for a variety of reasons, whether it be oil prices, demographics, corruption, is rotting from within. That being said, we have some immediate problems we have to fix. Back to my initial premise of hubris, I would argue that we have gotten ourselves into a problem in Syria with Russia that we could have seen coming a mile away. We should have known that Iran and Russia were going to have equities in Syria that outweighed ours, that no matter when we went in, that there was going to be a corresponding move from Russia and for Iran to try to combat whomever we were assisting. And so that's a terrible way to start that, because obviously I'm not forgiving or explaining away in any way, shape, or form the atrocities that the Russians have committed. But specifically on the issue of their policy rubbing up against ours, it's something that we could have potentially, avoided. And similarly, in Ukraine, you have to play the long game too. So what they want in Ukraine is for that country to be politically and economically rooted. They don't want to march on Kyiv. They don't want to militarily own that country. They just want to destabilize it to the point that ultimately a stooge of theirs gets put back in power in Kyiv. And so that means that the most important thing we can do in Ukraine is to economically and politically support the Poroshenko government or whatever follow-on government comes from there. And we've been, kind of lukewarm in our enthusiasm for doing that. Congress spends 3 times as much money, spends 3 times as much time talking about arming the Ukrainian military as we do about providing another round of financial assistance to the Ukrainian government, when the second is much more important than the first. I think there are problems we could have avoided. I think there are current problems that we could manage better. But I think overall we need to understand that this is a very weak regime that is at a moment of panic internally. Thus, they have to draw Russians' attention outward so that they're paying more attention to what Russia is doing in the Middle East or Ukraine, so they pay less attention to the fact that there are fewer jobs and fewer people and more social obligations that are going unfulfilled than ever before.
Okay, so now I have the answer to my question about optimism and pessimism, and which it was. So here's the answer. The answer is that we live in a world full of things that need to be fixed, whoever's going to fix them. But that there are people of some vision that how to fix them in a way that's not just a hammer for every nail. So that's one piece of the optimism. And the other thing is that really the kinds of things you're talking about are something new in the American political environment, which I don't know if it's just after 9/11, but which became particularly intensified after 9/11, which is the either or. And what you're really trying to do is saying, you can have both, maybe a little less of each, but both. And so for that, I think